Okay, briefly one can say that psychology originated during the latter part, at the latter part of the 19th century. And it developed from two perspectives. In Europe, from a more philosophical perspective, Wundt and Titchener, and from the USA, more from a physiological perspective, James. But the main emphasis was, in any case, the need to get more information on actions, the way in which people act, and the way in which their minds reflect in their actions. So the importance of psychological functioning clearly relates to ways in which we can assess such behaviors and things. Now, Wundt, when he started with his assessment, he wanted to find out how does the mind work, and focusing on a more systematic approach. He wanted to determine discrete entities that he could put together to get a feel. Titchener, who studied under him, said yes, but it seems to be more not just discrete entities, but more specific ways in which they meld. But James said no, what we need to do is to get to the consciousness of human behavior, and consciousness of human behavior is also influenced by the environment in which you function. So normally, or traditionally, or even recently, it has been said that assessment from a psychological perspective can be done from three aspects. The one is biological, the second is to call it psychological, and the third one is the environmental approach. The biological approach is more specifically interested in what happens in the mind. How do we recognize? How do we deal with different issues? How do we think? How do we perceive? What does the mind tell us? The psychological is more what do we do with what we have? How does it affect us as people in our character, in our personality, the way we act and react? But very important is the implications of the environment, because individuals are not islands. They are always in interaction with a variety of environments. And these levels of assessment we found particularly in the way in which the NIPR was established to start with, and how it developed over time. Professor Biesheuvel specifically focused from a more European approach, a more philosophical approach, but his focus was on identifying how individuals potentially, focused on wanting to identify individuals' potential, taking into account the environmental influences, particularly in a multicultural context. So he wanted to identify people who are illiterate, people who have little experience of Western thinking and so on. How can we identify their potential? So when the NIPR was established after the Second World War, where we were told that the NIPR would get money for the admin, but that the NIPR had to earn its own keep thereafter. It started with just a few departments, but specifically focused on the biological, and that was found in, for instance, the EEG department. Mundy Castle, Gordon Nelson, Bruce Murdoch. They did research as far as mind is concerned, measuring mind waves, for issues like determining of epilepsy, but also interesting work that was done in terms of deprivation, whether it's from a white or a black perspective. Workers in the old Naisna region who were living in a very isolated environment. To what extent does isolation negatively affect in the way in which they can act and react? They did extremely interesting work in terms of, for instance, decompression for women, pregnant women. They did work on twins. They did work on Kalahari Bushmen. They did work on a variety of aspects, but looking at how the mind worked. Also, fun part, because Mundy Castle was a character all on his own, they decided that they would like to know what happens when you use LSD. What happens in your mind? So volunteers were asked from the NRPR, would they like to be there and just take a little bit of LSD and have their waves taken, which they did. They never remembered what they did the next day. They also did research in terms of the use of alcohol, for which lots and lots of beer, both Banter beer and breweries beer, was brought in, and a great time was had by all while they were studying it. Another anecdote from Mundy Castle that one of the people indicated to us is when they went into the Sterkfontein caves in Krugersdorp, and when they went down, Mundy Castle asked the guide to please put out the lantern so that they can experience isolation and darkness, which they did. And then when they wanted to put on the light, they didn't know where the switch was, nor where the matches were. So the research done there was of groundbreaking nature, but part of the NRPR's work was always this almost fun aspect to it. It was practical research, testing theoretical inputs, but in a fun way to get answers. Second aspect relating to the personality relates to a number of psychological tests, and I think that of particular interest there is the work done at the mines, the work done with illiterates, the work done with young children. I'm thinking of Renee Liddycoat, for instance, who developed a little questionnaire trying to assess the mental potential of your little black children coming from a disadvantaged environment. So tests, selection, assessment of potential, assistance in the development of thinking skills, looking at cognitive reactions. Those are the kinds of things that was assessed in that particular group, particularly because that was, I think, more in line with what was the general way in which research was done. Another aspect, the third aspect, perhaps I should just mention some names as far as that's concerned. There we have names like, for instance, Professor Johan Skeppers, who did sterling work. We have Jerry Grant, who did unbelievable work. And we must not forget the work done by Dr. Bishebel himself, who continued going on with research or guiding research with the aim of ensuring that if psychological tests were used, that it is not assumed that coming from the Western world, it will give the correct answer when dealing with people in the multicultural context as we have it in South Africa. He was continually assisting people to look at things from a different perspective because he had a very inquisitive mind. But he was a very strong person in terms of, if you do research, there are certain processes and ways of doing it to ensure that the results you get are valid and reliable. Part of the research in the environmental field, it took a different way. The environmental studies were, amongst others, done by people like Getta Glass and Sally Hall. They were more of a social psychological perspective, and they tended to do macro surveys either at the request of big organizations or macro surveys in cooperation with international groups that wanted to have South African data to compare to what they get elsewhere in the world. That invariably required that they would have to go out for days on end into deep rural areas to get information. And they consisted of very beautiful teams, cooperative teams from different cultural groups that worked together. So the environment in that respect would give information that would be able to be used by your psychological groups, the testings. But with time it also became evident, that was when Biesheuvel was gone and Davie Gous became the director, became evident that we needed to earn more money. So you couldn't just hope that somebody would give a grant. So they developed the research departments and the applied department. Research would be statistics, analysis of statistics and things like that. The EEG department would be somewhat applied, somewhat research, more research, but a little bit of applied, giving a certain service to clients. But then they determined other divisions that actually were requested to develop questions, develop answers to questions put forward by clients. Can you help us, for instance, with a job evaluation system? What would work in South Africa? And that's the kind of thing Dr. Biesheuvel loved. So he immediately said, we have to start developing a job evaluation system. And he had Lucian Cortes, Dr. Lucian Cortes, and some of us to work on it, to develop it. It was decided that it would be based on a decision-making model. And after having developed it, then you have to apply it. But to apply it, you have to be able to analyze the jobs, which meant that you went down the mines to see how a person in the mine would work, the gas factory, how do they stoke the fires. Those were the kinds of things where, with a job evaluation system in mind, you practically analyzed what was happening. Similarly, you would have to go to people, for instance, senior investment manager, to ask him how does he know how to invest. And if he says by gut feel, you've got to ask questions to determine, well, what are gut feels? That's one aspect. Other aspects would be the so-called 6M game is actually a game that was developed to assist people with little knowledge about the experiences they would have in the workplace, particularly if they have no knowledge whatsoever, if they come from rural backgrounds. Now, the 6 M's are money, materials, manpower, management, machines, money, and market. And then later they developed a 7th one, which was motivation. This assisted people, if they came from the rural areas and had to go into factories, they would be there and they would be trained by playing with little cars and little shops and money, and they would play the game in being told, if you buy this, you have to have money to pay for it. If you pay for that, you may not have money to pay the salaries. So it was trying to teach the people how to deal with the realities of the environment in the work situation. This was such a good effort that it expanded. More and more people needed to have the training done. And it was also expanded eventually in the sense that it was upgraded to become part of your line supervisors, to assist them to understand what the subordinates had to do. And eventually it also developed into, we speak 6M language. That's the kind of thing. Now, that's a kind of practicalities. There was nothing like that. You had to develop it and you had to train people in it. And it was then sold to outside people who again would use it, and we would go on to something else. Similarly, it happened with the job evaluation system. The job evaluation system that was developed, it was called the Q method, which eventually, as Dr. Biesheuvel moved to the SA breweries, it was taken with him, and I think it was called the Paromnus there. And it is, in effect, in essence, there are some changes to it. It is still being used within many organizations. Again, typically, some of the products that were developed for use in a multicultural context where there is a Western approach and a rural need. Now, this also brings one to the work, amongst others, done by Ben McQuartley. Ben McQuartley was unbelievably valuable in the sense that as a registered industrial psychologist, he could go into where there were needs in terms of labor resources, problems they had, and speak the language of management and be able to coordinate the needs of the people to share with when there were problems or whatever the case might be. He and somebody else like Pauline Mkalipi, again, a registered industrial psychologist, no, she was a registered psychologist who specifically assisted with training, and particularly training of your rural women. So some of our colleagues were absolutely wonderful in being able to assist us to bring Western thinking to practicalities in terms of more rural experiences, assisting in the upliftment of people. Also interesting as far as research is concerned is in the basic research department of statistics, they started research with computers in the sense that long before it was accepted that you could put tests on the computer, they already did so, in the sense that they, for instance, put certain tests on some of those very big computers, trying to get things like the Rorschach and so on going, which is important because it was long before the challenges that we are faced now developed. Particularly Malcolm Coulter, he loves computers, and he really enjoyed playing around with different ways. He invariably needed a new computer because his ideas were growing bigger and bigger. But that in itself, although it was a basic research department, brought in money. And then just before I left there, very interesting, the theme started developing on artificial intelligence. That research should be done on the whole concept of artificial intelligence, which I think is still being done, particularly in Japan or China, where they have all these little bodies walking around. But that, I think, are certain of the aspects that over time developed. And if one then starts thinking that initially it was trying to identify how can we identify the mental models, the mental motions, the mental waves of illiterates developed in the NIPR. When I left, they were already at the stage of artificial intelligence. I've just thought of some more groundbreaking research that I think merits attention. Initially, very early on, just after the NIPR was established, the researchers were asked to do some work in the mines, and amongst others, it was a problem of communication. Somebody like Scotty Hudson was quite interested in seeing how could he improve on communication. So what he did is he thought, let's make posters so that whenever they walk anywhere, they are reminded of don't walk upstairs. See that things are done correctly. So he had these posters made, but unluckily some of the posters were interpreted in a different way than they should be. For instance, in one poster where it shows that the man is climbing a ladder, it was interpreted that, poor man, he's lost his leg. So they did not see three-dimensional. Another thing they did at the mines was the general adaptability battery that was developed and is still relevant today. They would make a film of it so that the miners could come in and they would get them to think about things and so on. And then they found that in showing the little film, the miners fell asleep because they had to get up very early in the morning and they had to come to work without food. So, wow, we're going to see this film so we can relax. Those practicalities that one had to think of in terms of South Africa. Then we have, as far as tests are concerned, somebody like Jerry Grant with spatial thinking and concept research. How do people spatially perceive? How conceptual? What do they do with it? Based again on the kind of work that somebody like Scotty Hudson and so on. Johan Skeppers was involved in that as well. Third, last, I think perhaps second last one is the form series test. A form series test was developed. Again, trying to tap potential from people who cannot read or write. So there's a test where you have to take certain forms and put them in certain ways, almost like the Raven's progressive matrices, but of a different nature. What Ian Kendall, I think, was involved in that. And then one aspect that I really should not forget about is Dr. Rooyening's Bushman work. Dr. Rooyening and his wife, and later Wendy Winter, did a lot of work with the Bushmen, getting to know them, getting to get a feel of their cultures, the way of doing things, the way of dealing with the needs for subsistence and aspects like that. And that meant that the team would very often go out and spend weeks, 10 days, perhaps even more, in the desert with the Bushmen. And some of the ladies who were with them, one, for instance, indicated that it was absolutely fascinating that after having sat there and discussed with them, they would ask the question, now, if you had a choice in life, what would you like? What would you want? And the answer individually from all of them came, we have food, we have a place to live, we have our family, what else do we want? Which gives you an identification of the rural environment and how comfortable they were. Now, Wendy Winter, for instance, did research there with awareness of colors. How do they differentiate colors? And for that, she had a pyramid of colors that they had to look at and identify the differences for them. And she found that basically it was similar to what you would find in any other place. There was also work done, I think, the rod and frame test, which was used again for pilots. To what extent are you environment embedded, or to what extent can you move beyond the embeddedness? All of these are aspects that were developed innovatively, not things that necessarily could be copied. So that what I try to identify is, and there are so many names that I could still mention that I haven't mentioned, but what I would try to identify is the fact that the work in the research, NIPR Research Institute integrated the biological, what happens in my mind, the psychological, how do I develop as an individual, and the environmental, to what extent does the environment impinge on all of this for me as an individual? And I think that was the initial notice, the initial message that Dr. Bisseville gave to us. Look at the human being as a gestalt. The human being cannot be cut down into pieces. The human being is a unique individual with unique potential. And we must try and tap that potential. We must try and determine how can we let each and every person develop to full potential, taking into account the fact that we come from different environments with different cultural expectations, and that must be taken into account when we are trying as psychologists to assess them. Another aspect that I have not touched on, but which I think is very important, is in the early days, we might need a particular instrument, a finger touch type of product, which you couldn't get anywhere. And then we had Dan DeWet, who made it for us. He was an interesting person. He sat in his little room at almost the cellar, where he manufactured whatever we needed for assessing either an individual or assessing groups of individuals. We would tell him this is what we need, and he would develop it. He, amongst others, also assisted when we decided, or when Dr. Bishewel suggested that we might need to look at predetermined motion time standards, which means that in order to determine the price of a product, you have to determine how long will it take to make it, apart from the cost of the raw material. For that we had two benches. We had a bench made in which you had to place certain forms. If you had, for instance, a square, then you had to pick up the square and you had to put it into the form there. And then you had to take another form and have to put it in another spot. And the moment you put it in, it would electronically indicate. As you pick this up, there's an electronic indication, this is the time, and when you fit it there, that is the time it was fitted there, which again assisted in identifying how long does it take. It's not a question of just taking and putting, it's a question of taking, turning and putting in. And that again was used for assisting in training, for instance, people in factories where they would take, let us say, putting bottles into cardboard boxes, assisting in the training, assisting in the developing of new techniques that could ensure that the people would function at the top of their. So, in effect, the work at the NIPR was one of trying to identify where the needs are, asking the client, now, what are your needs? And then in cooperation with the client, determining how best can we address it. But it was never done in isolation. We would always have meetings together where your psychological testing groups would share with us, and where we could go to the statistic department and where we could go to the EEG department, and they would assist us. It was a group cooperative effort within the NIPR. Now, that culture was created by Dr. Bishewel, but it was taken further by Dawie Gous. Dawie Gous, who at a certain stage had also worked at the NIPR. But Dawie Gous was the one who said, you've got to go up the street and get work. So that made us, as applied divisions, where we have to go and get the jobs. With that, the NIPR grew, and the next director that we had was Dawie Forster, and his absolute skill was the fact that the organization had grown, and now suddenly we needed more order and structure. It wasn't just a free-for-all. You couldn't just give beer for people to do EEG research. There had to be some formalization of it. So all of them had a particular value in the creation of the NIPR. I think the most important aspect for me in the almost 40 years that I worked there was the fact that it was a place where you were expected to keep abreast of the theoretical aspects in psychology, particularly in your own discipline then, but theoretical, but to be able to read between the lines where are possibilities for innovation, and where, if the client comes, that you will be able to present to the client possibilities, and through dialogue decide this is what needs to be done. And I think that led to the fact that the NIPR became an institute seen as of value, particularly because its name is personnel research within the field of industrial psychology. It was nationally and internationally because, again, we were expected to produce reports. We were expected to attend international conferences. We were expected to publish research reports. It was not a question of you do research and you sit in your office. You do research practically, you come back, you work, you publish it, and then go further. Another aspect that I haven't touched on is the whole concept of leadership. because there was a stage in which it was accepted that white males would only be leaders. And it was generally seen that women and people of color did not necessarily have the necessary skills to do so. So we did analysis of what are certain of the key responsibilities, what are key personality characteristics, and then we had we developed a game, again doing taking videos of people playing a management game, and in the process evaluating the decisions they were taking and assessing to what extent, if we said you've got so much money to spend and you better make a success of your business, where are they going off the rails? Is it because of communication? Is it because of decision making? Is it because of one person hogging the team? Where actually do the problems lie? And then after a period of time we would stop and then we'd give them feedback, show them what had happened. And he'll pardon if I were to say this, a typical example was in one particular stage, the team was going on and it was chaos. They were going absolutely down the drain when a young lady sitting next to a man said something and he was lending his ear, listening to her, and he didn't do anything about it. So if they'd listened to what she'd said, it would have been better. So we stopped it and we went back and we said, now, you're in dire straits. Let us see what would have happened if you'd listened to what this young lady had said. And they all turned around and said, but did she speak? Now, the message out of that is, first of all, listen when somebody speaks. But on the other hand, if nobody listens to you, speak again. Those were the kinds of things that one... And we did that with whites, people of color, and we eventually also did something similar in some of the northern Botswana, where we trained governors, people who had to act in a leadership position, but with no academic training and very little schooling, some of them, where again it was role play, where again it was sharing with them when it's good and when it's not good. Those were the kinds of things for which there was no model available, but you had to create it yourself. I think, as far as I'm concerned, first of all, I think it's an unbelievably privilege that I could do a career in which one could develop all of these different insights. And I think the one thing that might worry me at this stage with psychologists is they tend to want to rely perhaps too much on what exists, rather than trying to see what new should I be looking at, from whatever other perspective you should. But that you also accept that if you are dealing with a client, it's a dialogue that's required. It's not you telling them, it's them sharing with you, you ensuring that you hear what they are saying, going back, but invariably just being, it's a sharing situation and trying to find solutions to whatever the particular problems are, be it in the workplace, be it in marriage counseling, be it in whatever, and particularly being aware that human beings come from different cultures with different values, with different needs, but we all are unique in the sense that we have a mind, an environment, and certain qualities.